Hello, everyone. Welcome into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, November 1st, actually, around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about all of the big-time games down the stretch for all the conference and CFP races. Going to be a huge amount of games that I want to break down for you guys today around each conference, so definitely want to get to that first. Then we'll get to a couple of players and coaches under the most pressure as they head into this huge Week 10. Definitely a lot of coaches out there that are under a ton of pressure, including those two up in State College, Pennsylvania. Then we'll get into a little bit of Week 9 whip around, Week 10 whip around. We'll get to all the games we hadn't had a chance to get to thus far throughout the week, including Tulane's huge win yesterday. Then we'll get into all my best bets for the upcoming weekend. Definitely a lot of overs on here, and I'll try to, hopefully, we'll get some points this upcoming weekend. Then we'll get into a couple of talks around the injuries and the headline updates from this past weekend. Definitely a lot that has gone on, and definitely want to get you guys fully updated, including that Georgia-Florida game, the one going on this weekend, getting a little bit of a move for the time being. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat feature. Use that $ at the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page. You can ask any question, comment you'd like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be interactive, especially as we head down the home stretch of the season. It's going to be absolutely insane, and definitely want you guys to have as much say in the show as you possibly can. But before we do, also, GSMCpodcast.net is up and running, does the exact same thing, so either one of those you'd like to use, please do, and definitely make this just a little bit more interactive. But let's get into those games. Let's get into the November games that are going to be a part of the CFP race, because there's quite a few of them. I have about 3 per conference that I think are going to be huge for this year, and we'll start over in the SEC because there's a ton in the SEC, frankly. There's a number that I left off this list, but I do think it's going to be really interesting to watch. And I'll be honest, this was supposed to be a segment about just tiebreakers and breaking down all the different scenarios and what team would win and what team, how the tiebreakers would all shake out. The issue with that is it comes down to the winning percentage of your common opponents or your winning percentage of your conference opponents overall. We don't know what that's going to be yet. It's very, very hard to get a beat on that, especially with a month that I think is going to get a little bit off the rails. So hopefully we'll be able to figure that out in a couple of weeks. But as of right now, it's still too much football to play to be fully confident, at least, that we know what's going to happen in these races. But the game I'm keying on probably the most in the SEC, frankly, is Alabama at LSU. This is an elimination game. I feel very, very good about that. I do think, there's a mathematical world where a 9-3 Alabama or a 9-3 LSU could get in. I don't think it's a very real world. I don't think it's probably going to happen. And I do think they're probably out of the conference race as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with this one. But I have to assume whoever loses this game is not going to be in the playoff at the end of the year, is not going to be in the conversation for the SEC title down the stretch. Then you got Tennessee at Georgia. I thought about putting Georgia at Ole Miss here. I went Tennessee's direction just because Tennessee has 1 loss. Ole Miss does have 2. But I do think this is going to be a really interesting one. I do think the loser is out of the race for the SEC. The loser is out of the race for the SEC, but the loser is not out of the race for the CFP. That's what I was looking for, finally found it. But this is going to be a really interesting game and could be one where you're going to have a lot of 10-2 teams in the SEC. It could be that whoever loses this one is on the outside looking in because Tennessee has a win over Alabama. If Alabama goes down to LSU, they no longer have that argument. If Georgia beats Tennessee or loses to Tennessee, but then Alabama beats LSU, they have the tiebreaker over them. So it's very confusing kind of road that we're going to go down here, but this is a game where if you lose it, you're officially at the very least on a knife's edge when it comes to the CFP race. And then this one of the games that I am most excited for. I've been excited for it pretty much since Texas announced that they were going to the SEC, but this is a huge one. This is regardless of the CFP. This is a huge one for about everyone in the state of Texas, but for the CFP, we still have quite a ways to go. Texas has got to get through Florida, at Arkansas, Kentucky before they get there. A&M's got to get through, I believe, South Carolina this weekend, Auburn, as well as New Mexico State. So still have some work to do here, but this could be 2 teams that are not undefeated in conference, but playing for a spot in the SEC title. There is a weird path where A&M could lose this game and still get there, but again, that's something that we'll handle a little bit down the road as we get a little bit deeper into conference play. And then we got a team to watch for all the tiebreakers. We'll do this for every conference, but Florida is the team to watch. They're going to play Georgia, Texas, LSU, and Ole Miss ahead. As we understand, it's a crazy schedule. They lost to A&M by 13 and Tennessee by 6 earlier in the season. I think it is one of those things where if Florida were to beat one of these teams, they would immediately be in a tough spot against some of the other teams that Florida lost to. It is kind of confusing to get a beat on this, but regardless, Florida is a team to watch for all of these kind of matchup on matchup because the CFP will be using that when they get into that room. Then you got Ohio State, Penn State this upcoming weekend in the Big Ten, a huge one, no doubt about that. And this one has a lot more to do with the head coaches, which we'll get to in the next segment, than it has to do with really anything else. But definitely one that if you lose it, you're definitely on out of the Big Ten championship. Penn State technically could still get in, but I'd be very surprised. And then if you win it, you're firmly on your way possibly to a Big Ten title and then maybe to a CFP. And then you got Indiana at Ohio State. This is a huge one in a couple of weeks. Obviously, some work to get there. Indiana's got to get through Michigan State this upcoming weekend, but it could be a world where you have an 11-0 or a 10-0 Indiana team going up against a 9-1 Ohio State team. And it could be that if Indiana loses, they might get left out. An 11-1 Indiana that doesn't have those huge wins might be a team on the chopping block. So definitely something to watch there. Then you got Oregon at Wisconsin on November 16th, a huge one. Oregon should be favored in every game the rest of the way. No doubt about that. They got a huge one this weekend against Michigan, but I do think Wisconsin is a very, very interesting one to watch and definitely could shake up this race just a little bit. So in the Big Ten, where you don't necessarily have a huge amount of marquee games down the stretch, this is one that I would watch for sure. And then the tiebreaker team to me is Maryland. They've faced Oregon and Penn State, or they will going forward, and they've already lost to Indiana by 14 points. Something that I almost guarantee you will be brought up in the CFP room if Oregon can only beat them by 3 or if Penn State can only beat them by 1, and then Indiana's over there sitting with a 14-point win over this team. Then you got the Big 12. Texas Tech at Iowa State this upcoming weekend is huge. It's one of those games where Texas Tech falls. They're officially out of contention for the Big 12 for the CFP. Iowa State falls, and they're really they're in even footing at the very least with Colorado and Kansas State, with Kansas State at the very end of the year. They could still salvage this, no doubt about it, but definitely one that Texas Tech needs if they want to stay in. And Iowa State, it would put you in a really, really tough spot for the CFP, that is for sure. Then you got Colorado at Texas Tech. If Texas Tech were to win, they'd be inviting Colorado into town for another spot to possibly stay alive in the Big 12 race. And then Colorado's got to win out. They got to get a little bit of help here and there to find their way into the conference title game. But this is definitely one of those games that I do think could, at the very least, clear someone out. You know, if Texas Tech were to win this weekend, the loser of this game would be officially out of the Big 12 chase and out of the CFP race. Obviously. And then at the end of the year, we got Kansas State at Iowa State. I cannot wait for this one. This one is so much fun and definitely could be just an outright play-in game for who plays BYU in Arlington, because if all of those teams handle business the rest of the way, that's exactly what it'll be. Whoever wins this game will go to that Big 12 title game, and whoever loses will be sitting on their couch and probably watching the CFP from their basement or whatever. The tiebreaker team for me is Houston. I do think they're a team to watch as we head down the stretch. They lost to Iowa State by 20 earlier this year, plays KSU and BYU down the stretch. So definitely something to watch as we get into this, and definitely could be the difference when you come down to conference championship time. And then you got the ACC. Pittsburgh at SMU is a huge one, no doubt about it. I do think this will eliminate one of these teams, particularly SMU. If they were to lose, it would take them to 2 losses on the year, only give them 1 loss in conference, but would put them in a very weird spot moving forward. And then for Pitt, if you were to lose this game, you could still knock out Clemson, and you would have a very, very confusing world ahead of you in the ACC. It's one of those conferences that's very hard to get a beat on, and I know Anthony asked a question yesterday about what would happen if Miami, SMU, and Clemson went undefeated. Still kind of up in the air. It looks like it would be Clemson and Miami, but still one of those things that we're going to have to watch down the stretch, and definitely could switch up before that last weekend. We just talked about this one. Clemson at Pitt is a huge one in a couple of weeks, and it's definitely one where if Pitt were to lose Saturday, it's a pure elimination game from the CFP and the ACC race, because Clemson would go 10-2 or would be at 2 losses at the very least. Pitt would be at 2 losses for sure, and they would be at 2 losses in the ACC. Clemson would just be in a weird spot. If they were to lose to Pitt, especially if Pitt were to lose this upcoming weekend, they'd be behind Pitt, they'd be behind SMU, and obviously they'd be behind Miami as long as Miami handled business. And then we got Clemson at Virginia Tech. I think this is a really interesting one. Clemson's trying to go undefeated the rest of the way. Virginia Tech, if they win this weekend, they would be in the hunt. They would be in the hunt to possibly make a run at the ACC title. Now, they definitely need a couple of things to go their way. I do think they need to beat Clemson. I think they need Clemson to beat Pitt. I think they might need SMU to beat Pitt. It would be very, very confusing up there at the top, but they have the ability to somehow get back in this fight, and getting this one at home could be the difference. It's going to be a huge one for them, and definitely one that you're going to want to tune into. As for Miami, they pretty much should ride out the rest of the way. They do have a game against Georgia Tech that's interesting to watch, and definitely a couple others, but at the end of the day, Miami is the one that's firmly in the driver's seat here because they don't play Pitt, they don't play SMU, they don't play Clemson. They should be able to run the table and then have everyone else just kind of beat each other up. Let's say SMU were to win this weekend, or let's just say Pitt were to win this weekend and then lose to Clemson. Becomes pretty easy. It's Clemson and Miami. If, SMU were to win this weekend and then Pitt were to beat Clemson, it's probably SMU Miami. There's so many different ways that this could go, but at the end of the day, I do think Clemson is going to be a team that you're going to want to watch the rest of the way. They have huge games that pretty much the rest of the season with South Carolina at the very end, so definitely one team to watch. And then a tiebreaker team is Louisville. They have a couple of huge games already behind them with Miami and SMU. They lost to them by 7 points earlier in the year, and then Clemson and Pitt later. Clemson obviously this weekend, and then Pitt a little bit later in the year. So a couple of games that I think are just going to be huge. When you talk about these conference races, it's very, very hard to get a beat on what's going to happen, on how all of this is going to break down. But at the end of the day, you do have some games to watch at the very least. And, we'll figure out all the tiebreakers and all of that craziness down the road. There's going to be a lot of craziness in the SEC in particular because there's quite a few teams that are still very much in the hunt over there. But at the end of the day, I do think those are the games you should be watching for this upcoming month. The outcomes of those will dictate a lot as we head forward, and probably in about 2 weeks, I'll be able to really unpack all of the craziness around the tiebreakers and everything and feel a lot more confident about what I'm saying. Just didn't want to get too far out ahead of myself and be saying things that never end up happening. So we'll break it down in a couple of weeks here, but definitely those are the games you want to watch in the meantime. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about the players and the coaches under the most pressure as we head into this weekend, and I think you'll know the first two that I'm going to talk about.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the biggest games down the stretch of this season. If you want to know what's going to happen in the conference races and the CFP races, because it's going to be rather confusing. I will do my best to keep you updated as we move along, but these tiebreakers are definitely going to be a big part of it, and they're very hard to break down until you get much closer to the end of the season. But let's get into the players and the coaches under the most pressure as we head into this week, because there's quite a few, and I think the two biggest might just be up there in State College. But we'll start with the guy that's wearing scarlet and gray, because this one's going to be huge. There's no doubt about that. I think when we talk about Ryan Day around this time of year, we expected to be talking about him as an undefeated coach. He is not that. He does have one loss, and he's heading into a game where he is the less lower ranked team. That's what I was going for. He is the lower ranked team, and you're finally having the game of Ohio State, Penn State, where at the very least it feels like they are on the same level. It feels like they are teams that could be just in a dogfight the entire day, and whoever comes out, I wouldn't be overly surprised one way or the other. I did pick Ohio State, but at the end of the day, if he does want to coach at Ohio State in 2025, I think he needs to win this game. I was just watching Josh Payton, Cole Kubelik talk about this, where they said pretty much when these boosters make up their mind, they make up their mind. I can almost promise you there is going to be a lot of people in Ohio and the surrounding areas that are going to make up their mind on Saturday if they lose. I think they will be pretty much out on Ryan Day. I don't know if it's going to be very easy to get him back in. And this is going to be a huge game for him because the reality is, I think he's a very good coach. I think he has every ability to be very successful at this program. Thing is, they get impatient up there. At some point, they're going to get impatient. And if you finish 10-2 and put yourself even in question of the CFP, I do think there's going to be a lot of people that have made up their mind and probably won't move backwards. So could be one of the biggest games of Ryan Day's career this upcoming weekend. And then on his sideline, you got to deal with Will Howard. He has a ton of pressure on himself this upcoming weekend because his O-line is just not very good. His O-line is under a lot of scrutiny this upcoming weekend. There's going to be a lot of different things that they're going to be thrown at, and definitely something that he's going to need to just step up to the plate. He is a big-time player. He is a guy that came to Ohio State for this reason. He wants to play Penn State. He made that very, very clear with some of the comments that he had earlier in the week talking about how they didn't recruit him. He wants to prove something, and that's the goal. He very much needs to go in there and kind of just I don't want to say tear this team to pieces. He needs to play really good football. He needs to play very confidently. He needs to be the guy that just walks into that stadium and totally takes over and is the story of the weekend. So it's one of those weekends where he knows what this is about. He knows how big it is for Ryan Day, and that means it's massive for that Ohio State quarterback. And then on the other sideline, you do have James Franklin waiting there, just trying to get that big-time win of his career. And this could be kind of a turning point in his career. He is 1-6 and at home against top 10 teams. If he gets this one, it could be a total turning point. It could be the point where a lot of stuff starts to happen in terms of they go to the CFP, they possibly win a game there, they maybe even get a bye, win the Big Ten, do a ton of things that they've waited quite some time around there to do. That being said, they lose this game, he's under a lot of scrutiny, and whether that's fair or not, I don't know, but at the end of the day, there will be some Penn State fans that are just kind of sick of feeling that feeling, and it's definitely going to be a very interesting kind of end of the season for him. And then on top of that, just for fun, you got to deal with the quarterback situation. I do think Drew Aller is going to go, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's definitely something that he's going to have to handle from pretty much down to down and figure out who gives him the better chance to win. It's going to be a really, really interesting tightrope walk, and he's going to have to handle it very well. So this is one of those games that could be a huge moment in James Franklin's career, could kickstart him on to incredible success. It could be the day that a lot of Penn State fans write him off and probably never pick him back up again. And then you got Mike Elko. This is a funny thing for Mike Elko, and it's a really cool thing more than anything else because it's something he's probably been waiting for quite some time. He is fighting something as a head coach that he really has never needed to: complacency. And this happens really at Texas A&M. Doesn't necessarily happen too much at Duke. You know, it's not necessarily something that Duke has to worry about at least too much because you don't have a second to be complacent. You're not nearly as talented as a lot of those other teams out there. A&M is, and he is one of those guys that has walked into this job and done about as good of a job as anyone in the entire country. I've been talking about Coach of the Year on here a lot. It is incredibly hard to pin it down because you could go Kurt Cignetti, I'd be more than on board. You could go Mike Elko, I'd be more than on board. You could go Deion Sanders, I would be more than on board. But at the end of the day, Mike Elko's done an incredible job, and I think the biggest thing is just keeping your guys grounded. It is so hard to keep your guys fully in this moment, especially with a game like Texas in a couple of weeks. They want that game. They want it to be for a spot in the SEC title. They don't get there without a win here. So it's going to be a huge one. And then like James Franklin, he's staring down a quarterback issue, and he's got to figure out who gives him a better shot. His job is probably a little bit tougher, frankly. It's one of those games where things get a little bit sketchy, and then you got to decide, do you keep Marcel Reed in there? Do you even start Marcel Reed to start the game? It's going to be very, very interesting, and one where I wouldn't be surprised even a little bit if we saw both quarterbacks in this game and no one really took it with a ton of confidence at the very least, or took the job, I guess, with a ton of confidence is what I mean there. And then you got Eli Holstein. This is a very, very talented player, and I think this is one of those moments where he can put his team in very firm position to be 11-1 and possibly be heading to the CFP. Another team that at 11-1 I'm a little bit worried about, but at the end of the day, I do think they would have just enough to possibly be that third team from the ACC that finds their way in. That being said, they win this one, they're still undefeated, and they have Clemson coming to their place. So they have every ability to win that game, go undefeated, meet Miami in the title game, and definitely be in the CFP. So this is one of those weekends where everything could change for this team this year, and everything could change for Eli Holstein, excuse me. I always do Holstein when he gets into the NFL draft, because the reality is this is one of the top guys in the 2026 NFL draft, at least as of right this second. As we all know, it changes quite a bit in your last year in college. But at the end of the day, this is a player that starting tonight and really starting early on this year, but definitely starting on Saturday, could have a huge performance, put himself at the very top of the line with guys like Nico Iamaleava, with guys like Arch Manning, with guys that have the ability to be elite NFL talents. So does this guy. He has every ability to do that and definitely could put his name very, very tough, very towards the top. So it's one of those moments that so far Pitt has not really had to deal with. You're going on the road to a really, really tough spot and to a team that can really go punch for punch with you. So you might have to win this game 42-41, but Eli Holstein, regardless, is going to have to be a huge player in this one. On the other sideline, you got Scott Simons, and he has to deal with a whole lot as the defensive play caller for SMU. And you have Eli Holstein. That's an incredibly tough player to corral in and of itself. Then you got Desmond Reed. Then you got Kanata Munfield. Then you got a number of other guys that are going to cause issues for you on the defensive side of the ball. And SMU's been a little bit hit or miss. They've played good defense at times, and those linebackers fly all over the field, and then at times they'll get beat deep a couple of times per game, and it's one of those things where you probably can't have that happen here. You don't have the ability, especially with a quarterback that a little bit up in question this week, so we'll talk about that a little bit later, but especially with all of the questions that you have to make sure that everyone is fully locked in on what you're doing, and you have to make sure that you're doing everything you can from a play calling perspective to put them in the best position to win, because the reality is your defense is going to have to step up at some point. It can't just be that shootout that we just talked about with Eli Holstein. It can't be that for SMU probably. It's one of those things where they could technically keep up. I think they're more likely to make the mistake than Pitt is, so you probably want to make this one just a little bit gross, and Scott Simons is pretty much the only way that they're really going to be able to do that. Then you got Ashton Jeanty, and this is one that I want to talk about here because you have a huge conference game at night at a normal time at 8 p.m., not at 10:30 or whatever they normally kick off at. He has a real chance to, I don't want to say take a hold of the Heisman race, but I do think he could find himself back towards the top. I think, Dylan Gabriel's been making up a ton of ground. Cam Ward is doing Cam Ward things. You have Travis Hunter just being an absolute monster over there in Boulder. He needs a big performance. He needs something to catch everyone's eyes. He needs something to bring everyone right back to Boise State because they were all there early in the season. We were all fully locked in on what this kid was doing. Last week, it was a good performance. It was absolutely fantastic. The thing is, it wasn't gaudy. It wasn't insane. He didn't have that big run that everyone's been waiting for. He's probably got to have it tonight. I don't know what the line is. I don't know what he needs. I know for a fact that if he got 200 yards and 2 scores or 3 scores, everyone would immediately be talking about him again, and they probably should be talking about him right now. But at the end of the day, you would get him back on the radar for the possible Heisman win, and it's one of those games where you're going to have the ability to take advantage of this team. You're going to have the ability to possibly make some plays. You got to make a lot of them. There's no doubt about that. You absolutely have to get after this team and absolutely have to put up a stat line where a lot of these people that vote on the Heisman that will wake up on Saturday after having slept a little bit early and not watch this game, they can look on the ESPN app and they can actually see those numbers because, as we all know, that's probably all they do. But at the end of the day, it's going to be really interesting to watch and definitely a player that in this week where a lot of stuff is going on around him as Ohio State gets all the attention, as Pitt and SMU get a lot of the attention, he could become one of those Heisman guys once again. Maybe Duke can slow down Cam Ward and help him out a little bit. But at the end of the day, it is going to be a huge game for this player and definitely one that he's going to need to make a statement in. And then finally, Curt Cignetti. I think this is a very interesting game for Indiana because you're going up to a place that is not necessarily easy. Michigan State really did a very good job against Michigan last week. They did not play bad football at all. They had one mistake. And if they didn't have that one mistake, they're probably walking out there with a win and getting a huge one and heading into this one with a lot of confidence. But this is a huge one for Curt Cignetti to handle because you were an undefeated team. And you're heading into a stretch with Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, and I can't remember who they finished with. Maybe Purdue. That sounds right. But at the end of the day, he's going to have to deal with that. One way or the other, he's going to have to make sure his guys are up and ready to go every single week. At Michigan State is not necessarily an easy one. It's one that you should be able to score quite a bit on this team. Doesn't mean you can stop them. They have a very, one of those kind of chaos team abilities. They have the ability to kind of turn it on for an afternoon, create problems for you defensively, and then get out with a weird win. So it's one of those things that he's just going to have to deal with a lot of complacency down the stretch of this season. Obviously, his guys will be locked in, but he's going to play a couple of games that they're going to get beat up a little bit, and he's going to have to be able to at least, hold serve in that respect. And I do think on top of that, the quarterback thing is going to be a factor here. I think Curtis Rourke is going to go in this game. The question is, how close to 100% is he, and is he able to go the entire game, or is it Taven Jackson again? Another thing that Curt Cignetti is going to have to handle among a number of other things throughout the rest of the year. But at the end of the day, it's going to be awesome to watch all of those guys go to work, and definitely quite a bit of pressure to go around this upcoming weekend, but quite a bit of it is in State College, Pennsylvania. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we just got to get into a little bit of a whip around all the games that have already happened throughout this early part of the week, and then we got to get to a couple of games that are a little bit under the radar for this upcoming Saturday. So stick with us, and we'll be right back with that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the players and the coaches under the most pressure as we head into this week. Quite a bit of it to go around, but a lot of it is up there in State College, Pennsylvania. Definitely something to watch, as those two head coaches might just need the win to keep that job. I know it sounds crazy, but a huge one up there in State College. But let's get into a little bit of a whip around to all of the games we hadn't had a chance to get to. It is week 10. I don't realize, I don't know why I put week 9, but apologies for that. It is week 10. We're heading into a huge one this upcoming weekend, but let's get into a couple of games that have already happened. And we'll start with Louisiana, Texas State, and we'll start with Keon Martin, Keon Martin is a Louisiana cornerback. He had a very scary moment in the game earlier this week. He was taken off the field in a stretcher, was taken to the hospital. He has been discharged. It was a very, very scary moment, but it seems like he is on the way to recovery, hoping for the best for him going forward, obviously, but definitely a really scary moment that kind of puts into perspective what this game is and a lot of the different dangers of it. So hoping for the best for him and his family, but definitely one where you're going to want to at least be on the lookout for updates for him, because hopefully everything goes very smoothly the rest of the way. Seems like he's on the right track to start. But as for this game, this Louisiana team is one step closer to a possible Sun Belt title, with Ben Woolridge just playing really, really good football. 18 for 28, 252, one touchdown on the day. Jelon Washington is a beast at running back. And one of their top wide receivers, actually, is a former top quarterback in the recruiting class of 2019. Lance Lejeune is a very talented player. If you watch this show, QB1, you remember that player. He is on Louisiana now. He's a very good wide receiver for that team. So this is a very fun team for Louisiana. They very badly needed this win. It could have gotten Texas State back into the hunt. It is probably officially knocked Texas State out, and they're going to have some huge ones coming up. They still have Arkansas State, South Alabama, UL Monroe, but they have every ability to run the table there, get to a Sun Belt title, and possibly be a 12-1 team at the end of the day. And I don't think they're in the CFP race, but who knows with all the craziness that could happen. Then we have one team that was officially knocked out of the CFP race earlier this week. It was Liberty. It was a team that, frankly, they were probably knocked out when that game against App State got canceled for the Hurricane, to be totally honest with you. But at the end of the day, they've officially taken their second loss on the season. They are officially out of this race, and definitely something that they haven't lost 2 straight games since the end of the 2022 season. So been quite a bit of time before since they've lost 2 straight games, and they lost to a Jacksonville State team that just ran the ball. They were absolutely dominant, and Tyler Huff, the quarterback, had 130 on the ground, but Trey Stewart was really the guy to watch, the guy on your screen actually right there, 232 on the day, 4 touchdowns, including a 75-yard touchdown run. The dude was all over the place. He was absolutely incredible, but Jacksonville State moves to 4-0 in Conference USA, 5-3 on the season. They have a couple of huge games against Sam Houston State as well as Western Kentucky coming up, but this is a team that possibly could be at the Conference USA title, and it could just be that them and Western Kentucky rematch in the Conference USA title a week after they played. Then you got Tulane Charlotte. This one went down last night. Tulane gets a relatively comfortable win. It wasn't all that comfortable in the first half. Did not play the prettiest first half in the world, but outscored Charlotte 24-0 in the second half. Had a pick 6, had 2 forced turnovers on downs as a defense, and if you're getting that from this defense, you're going to have a lot of success. And then on the offensive side of the ball, if you have not watched Mekhi Hughes yet, you're going to want to watch Mekhi Hughes. He is a very, very special player and one of those guys that if you don't get to see him now, it might be a while before you get to see him again. He's a very, very talented player and so much fun to watch over there in that Tulane offense. He topped 100 yards for the 6th time this year on earlier this week or yesterday. Definitely a beast and someone that could be in this could be a part of a CFP run for Tulane towards the end of the year because they're going to need a little bit of help. But they could end the season with wins over Navy, Memphis at the very end of the year, Army in the American Championship, and then if Boise State falls again, I think this could be the team. I think this might just be the team if Boise State were to fall again and they were able to run the table with those types of wins. Then we got that Boise State team. San Diego State comes to town to Boise for a huge game, and San Diego State is really just looking to shock the world here. They're 3-4 on the season. They're 2-0 in conference, so they have every ability to win this game and possibly be in the conference, the Mountain West Conference race down the stretch of the season. They would be 500 on the year, but at the end of the day, you'd be 3-0 in conference and be in a relatively good spot going forward. Now, their defense does give up 175 yards on the ground per game, so you're going to have a tough time against this Ashton Jeanty kid because he is an absolute problem. The question is, can he catch Barry Sanders? That's going to be the big question the rest of the way. If he wants to break it in the regular season, he's going to have to get over 250 yards per game. I know that sounds insane. That's because what Barry Sanders did was absolutely insane. If he gets into the conference championship and only has that, it's about 209 per game. If he goes a little bit deeper into the playoff, then obviously he has a little bit more time. But if he puts on a show here, if he gets 250 yards, even maybe 300 yards, we have seen it from this kid, it could be one of those days where he is right back into the hunt to break that Barry Sanders record and everything for the Heisman becomes very real for this Ashton Jeanty kid. Then you got Memphis at UTSA, and this is a huge one over in the American because Memphis, as low as I was on them early in the season, they're a 7-1 team. They only have the loss to Navy, a team that is kind of in a weird spot with Tulane coming up with a couple of big-time games on the road. It's going to be really interesting to see how they end the season, but Memphis, right now, they're 3-1 in conference. They do have Tulane to end the year. UTSA has every ability to go in there and make it just a little bit ugly. For Memphis, Seth Hannigan has been rolling right along. Really, since that Navy loss, they've been really playing really good football, and they could be sitting at 11-1 at the very end of the year, having beat Tulane, going to the American Championship against maybe Army, maybe Navy, who knows. Getting that win could put them in a very good place for the CFP. It definitely is one of those things where all of these teams likely need Boise State to lose a game the rest of the way, but the door could definitely be open in a second, no doubt about that. And then this is a game where it could be very tough for UTSA to just handle Rock Taylor, to handle Demir Blankopsy, to handle Kobe Drake, a lot of really talented guys. And I think this is one where Memphis just kind of rolls in, continues the momentum, and hopefully continues that roll towards the CFP, possibly berth. Then you got UCLA, Nebraska, a huge one over there in the Big Ten, one that, if you look at that over-under, it is not going to be a high-flying game by any means. These two teams are going to run the ball. They are going to keep the ball on the ground. Now, UCLA does like to throw the ball quite a bit, actually. It's not necessarily that they are a ground-and-pound team. is just to say they don't do very well when they pass the ball necessarily. So I expect them to be a little bit more run heavy in this game. I expect this game to just be a little bit more of one of those Big Ten games. And UCLA looking to kind of get on a little bit of a win streak here. They got a win over Rutgers last week for their first Big Ten win of the year. They win here, they're 4-5 and have at least somewhat of an ability to possibly get to a bowl game and really salvage this season. For Nebraska, it's really just getting a positive after last week. Last week was a very, very tough one, but at the end of the day, I do think it was a huge one for them. I think it can build a lot of momentum. You got to be able to win a couple of games down the stretch, and you definitely have to be able to win this one. I do think that Nebraska is able to take care of business here. I thought this line was a little bit weird when I saw it. I thought it would be a little bit more in the Nebraska direction, so I am going to go Nebraska. I do think they're able to get this win, and frankly, I'd probably take the points as well. Then you got Wisconsin, Iowa, a really interesting game over there. You have two 5-3 teams. They're 3-2 in conference. Probably not in the conference race necessarily unless craziness happens up top, but they have every ability to make things interesting and at least make things tough for a lot of the teams up top. But for Wisconsin, they're coming off a very tough loss that they probably think they should have won. You know, that Jalen Reed interception just changed absolutely everything. If they're able to avoid that, even just that in and of itself, I think that game looks a lot different, and Wisconsin's possibly able to win, kickstart their season, but at the end of the day, you came out on the wrong side, and now you got to go on the road to a really, really tough environment, a really tough team. And then for Iowa, you had a little bit of a quarterback change this past weekend that we'll talk about a little bit later. They've scored 40 points twice this year, which sounds absolutely crazy, but I think this one's going to be a little bit more of a battle. I do think it's probably Iowa's game to win, but it's going to be really interesting. I like this Wisconsin team. I'm a little bit worried that some of the stuff we saw was, I don't want to say a mirage, but playing some teams that are a little bit inferior to them. Definitely will be interesting to see what they can do against a team that's relatively, at least, on even footing with them. And then finally, you got TCU at Baylor, a huge one in the Big 12, and one that these two teams are really just gearing up to be spoilers the rest of the way. And one of those games where I think this one could get crazy. You know, you have these games that could be up or overtime potential, have two overtime potential, get a little bit crazy. This would probably be at the very top of my list. I think this is going to get a little bit weird over there in Waco and definitely be one of, not a place that it's weird to get weird in Waco, but at the end of the day, I do think this is going to be a really interesting game. TCU is a team that is really just looking to get things kickstarted. I think since that 2022 season, Sonny Dykes has been looking for that big thing. They've been looking for that great end of the season that puts them in a really good spot. If they win here, they have a good chance of going 8-4 this year, putting themselves at least in a spot where you can kind of kickstart things as you head into 2025, possibly get a couple of big-time transfers, and then head on your way. And then for Baylor, it's still about keeping Dave Aranda's job. It's still about saving that job that is still relatively in flux. I do think he has the ability to, if they're able to win this game, obviously, I think he's able to keep that job, but I do think it's one of those things where pretty much week to week, they're going to have to handle business. If they're not able to here, it could get a little interesting. I think I'd lean TCU in this game. I think it's going to be really close and kind of a battle, but I think I'd lean towards the Horned Frogs here. It's going to be an awesome week with so many different games that are going to be worth watching. Obviously, Ohio State, Penn State is going to steal the show, but there's tons of others that are definitely worth your time, and hopefully you just found a couple of them there. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about my best bets for this upcoming weekend. There's quite a few that I want to get on the record, and definitely some that I think are a little bit ambitious, but I feel pretty good about them going into this one.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the under-the-radar games for this upcoming weekend. Definitely a ton that are going to be really interesting, including a huge one for Ashton Jeanty tonight where he's got to put up big numbers. He's got to be able to get everyone's attention tonight, and we'll see if he can do it against a team that is not great against the run in San Diego State. But let's get into my best bets for this upcoming weekend because I got 8 of them here. We've done relatively well this season. Not necessarily perfect by any means, but definitely on the right side of things and feeling pretty good about where I'm at right now. But let's get into this week 10 because these were a little bit harder to find. There's not necessarily these huge ones that I absolutely love this week, but there's definitely enough that I think I can get into. And we'll start with that Army game. I do think Army's going to be able to just roll Air Force in this game. They're minus 22 right now. I do think they cover that number. Now, Army does have a huge amount of hurdles going forward. They have to be able to at least compete with Notre Dame. I'm not really sure how that's going to play in the CFP. Does a loss to Notre Dame sort of at a neutral site trump a loss to Oregon for Boise State? I don't really know how that's going to go down, but at the end of the day, you have quite a few hurdles going on. I do think there's a world where maybe they look forward just a little bit to Notre Dame. I think the rivalry aspect takes that out of it just a little bit. I do think they're going to want to be able to kind of lay their wood on Army the same way they've been able to do with really every team around the country. Air Force gave up over 300 yards rushing to Navy, and Army probably has a more potent attack than Navy. So I think Bryson Daly has a huge day. I do think this is one of those games where they probably win by like 4 touchdowns. They're probably up by like 3 touchdowns at halftime, frankly. Then you got Vanderbilt Auburn over 48.5 is my next one. I do think this is a very interesting game down there in Auburn this upcoming weekend. There are a number of really talented players on both offenses, no doubt about that. There's a couple of injuries on both offenses as well, but I do think the under is just going to make too much sense here. Vanderbilt has struggled this year with teams that have very athletic defensive lines that can stop kind of that north-south run. If they can't get Cedric Alexander, who is one of the guys that is questionable, if they can't get him running downhill, it's going to be really hard to get a lot of the stuff they do off of that, where you do the zone read, where you do a lot of the RPOs where they get out on the edge. A lot of those things can't really get going if you're able to stop that north-south run the way that Texas was a week ago, where that Vanderbilt offense looked a little bit more clunky than it has pretty much the entire year, and Auburn can absolutely do that. Maybe not to the same level Texas can, but absolutely it has a ton of athletic guys and can kind of slow down this rushing attack for Vanderbilt. I think for Auburn, they have that big playability, no doubt about that. But this Vanderbilt back end is plenty capable of taking the ball away, and they have an ability to make the most of it. I do think it's one of those games where Auburn hits a couple of big-time shots over the middle of the field. I also think it's one of those games where Vanderbilt's able to find just enough openings. Although, if you don't get that north-south run game going, it could get a little bit itchy. I think Vanderbilt's able to make enough plays. I think Auburn especially is able to make enough plays over the middle of the field and things get, at the very least, over that 48.5 number. It's one of those that I was a little bit on the fence about, but I do think these offenses are just looking for that big-time game. I think they'll be able to get at least enough in this one. And then I like Georgia, minus 16.5 at Florida. This is a very interesting game, one where you do have the rivalry aspect, and you do have Florida coming in with a ton of energy, playing really good football. So obviously, there's a little bit of juice around Florida. I think there's quite a few people probably picking Florida right about now. But I just think this is a really bad matchup against a team that seems to be kind of finding their stride. The Georgia offense has been able to not really find the run game this year, and it's one of those things that they're going to have to down the stretch. Thing is, Tate Ratledge comes back this week. If he comes back, I think this jump starts this offense. I think you see Trevor Etienne really start to get going against this former team, and I think they get incredible push on the offensive line. For Florida, I think this UGA pass rush is going to be too much. I think DJ Lagway is a really talented player. I don't think he's dealt with something like this, and I think it's going to get to him just a little bit. He'll turn over the ball a couple of times, and I think UGA wins by 21, 24 points. I really do think they go to work in this game, and I think that Carson Beck has a little bit of a coming out party in Jacksonville. Then you got Navy minus 11 at Rice. This is one of those games that's very, very interesting. You have a Navy team coming off a really tough loss to Notre Dame where they gave the ball away quite a few times, and then you have a Rice team that just got rid of Mike Bloomgren as their head coach. It could be really interesting because it's one of those things where sometimes you get a little bit of a bump from those teams right after they lose a coach. Sometimes you get a little bit of a dip. So we'll see what happens in this one. Navy is still a team that's in the CFP, but they also know they have to run the table the rest of the way. I do think if they're able to win the American, they're very much in the conversation, and things get really interesting in a hurry. That being said, they would have the tiebreaker over Memphis. They would have to win over Tulane the rest of the way. So definitely a lot of tough things coming, but at the end of the day, they are definitely a team that can make their way to the American Championship, and possibly make some noise in that. And then for that Rice team, they're not necessarily great at stopping the run. And I think Navy is one of those teams that just made a ton of mistakes last week. There's no way they get the amount of luck or bad luck they did a week ago. So I think this one could get ugly. I think Navy wins this one comfortably, at least by 14, but maybe by even a little bit more than that. I like the A&M South Carolina under 44.5, and this one makes me a little bit nervous because that number is so low. But at the end of the day, this is a huge game for Texas A&M, one of the bigger ones in their SEC history, because you win this one, you put yourself in a very, very good position to possibly run the table, to meet Texas at the very end of the year, and almost definitely get into the playoff. Obviously, there's some hurdles there, some craziness that could be worked out, but at the end of the day, you're almost definitely going to the playoff if you're able to handle business here, and then obviously able to win at Auburn in a couple of weeks. But it's one of those things where it's going to stay on the ground in this game. South Carolina is a team that doesn't necessarily want to get into a shootout, doesn't necessarily want to get into a world where Lenore Sellers has to make a ton of plays with his arm down the field. Now, on the other side, I do think it's going to be Marcel Reed. I think Marcel Reed is going to be able to go in this game, and I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see how this approach is against a really athletic defensive line. Maybe it's one of those things where this run game doesn't quite get going the way that they want, and they have to make a quarterback change or something crazy happens. But I really do think this could become something of a field goal off. I don't think there's going to be a ton of running room in this game, although Le'Veon Moss has every ability to get going in this game. I don't necessarily think it's going to be all that pretty. I think it's going to be a really tough rock fight, and whoever comes out on top. I picked South Carolina, but it's going to be a battle one way or the other. I think whoever wins this one probably wins the line of scrimmage battle, and that's going to be one that's going to be a fight pretty much from start to finish. So a huge one over there, and I think it's going to be a little bit of a rock fight in Columbia. Then you got USC Washington. I have the under 55.5. I think this is going to be a really interesting game because both these offenses have really struggled over the past couple of weeks. I think they're both kind of trying to make that big-time statement. Thing is, they're going up against really, really bad matchups for their team. Now, Washington, I do think, could get something going in this game. For USC, you're throwing into one of the best maybe the best pass defense in the entire country in Washington. You have to be able to really thread a needle on some of these throws, and as good as Miller Moss has been, and as good as I think he is, it could be one of those games where it just kind of the wheels fall off a little bit, and Washington decides let's just run the ball. Let's just keep everything on the ground, not give them any big explosive plays on the defensive side, not give them that big jolt that they need, and just kind of handle business here. I wouldn't necessarily think that's crazy at all, and I think it's just one of those games where it starts really, really slow. I don't necessarily think either of these teams really get on the board, at least aggressively, until the second half, so I could see something like 14-7 at halftime, or 10-3, or something crazy, and then things open up just a little bit, but not to that 55.5 number. I do like Clemson, minus 10.5 at Louisville. This is a bad spot for Louisville. They're going on the road. I believe they're playing their 7th straight game, which is absolutely insane on their 7th straight week. So they got a lot of things to figure out in this game, and they're going up against a team that hasn't necessarily had a true test since Georgia. So I fully understand being a little bit nervous about Clemson going into this game. But the reality is, I do think they've looked like a well-oiled machine. I think that offense is going to be just a load for Louisville to deal with. They're not necessarily a great defense on either aspect in pass defense or run defense, but they're absolutely a team that maybe if you commit to one part, you can absolutely stop this offense, but I'd be a little bit surprised. I think they have too many weapons. I think Cade Klubnik's running this offense too well, and I think this O-line is going to be able to hold up against this Louisville D-line. For Louisville, it's been a lot of feast or famine offensively. They've been able to make that big-time play, or they've been able to turn the ball over quite a bit and make a couple of mistakes and possibly give a team too many chances to win a game. You do that with Clemson, you're going to be in a really tough spot. And I think that Clemson D-line is going to not give you any room to run the ball. So I think Clemson wins this one. I think they win it pretty comfortably. I think they somewhat, at the very least, put everyone else in the country on notice. They make sure that everyone understands that this is a very real team, a team that could be dangerous down the stretch, and definitely one that is worth your time to watch because they're really, really fun, and I think it starts this weekend with a huge win. And then I do think that Indiana-Michigan State game gets over that 51.5. This is another one where you have Curtis Work coming back from injury, a little bit nervous about what's going to happen there, but at the end of the day, I think this Indiana offense is just ridiculous. I think they have every ability to score on pretty much anyone in the country. I don't think it's going to be much of an issue here. Now, obviously, you got to make sure you're ready to go, and you have to make sure that these Michigan State players can't necessarily key in on one thing. But at the end of the day, I do think it's going to be a load for Michigan State to handle. On the Michigan State side, I think Aiden Childs is just waiting for that big-time performance. He played really well in the second half of that Iowa game, but I think there's a big one in him. I think he has one in this back end of the season that is going to shock some people, is going to put some people on notice for this kid, and it could very well be this game. Maybe he puts on a show in this one, maybe ends Indiana's undefeated season. It makes things really interesting around that Michigan State team going into 2025, but I think it's one of those games where it probably stays on the ground a little bit. Indiana's run defense is absolutely elite. I think this one is a little bit of it's one that I think you're going to have a couple of big plays in. I don't necessarily think it's going to be consistent scoring top to bottom. I think it's going to be a little bit of a fluctuating ebb and flow type of thing. But at the end of the day, I do think you're going to get enough points to get over that 51.5. I think Curtis Work makes enough plays in coming back as the quarterback for Indiana and Michigan State. I think Aiden Childs just has one on Saturday. I really do. I think he has every ability to explode in one of these games, and it might just be his time to do that on Saturday. But a ton of big-time games, and when you look at these best bets for this upcoming weekend, I think there's quite a few on the board right now that are just a little bit sketchy. You know, you worry that maybe Vegas has it right. Like the Nebraska game we just talked about a little bit ago, it's -6. I probably would go a little bit in Nebraska's direction. That being said, I don't want to go against Vegas and then look like an idiot. So I'm going to roll with the ones that I got. I do feel relatively good about those, and I think it could be one of those weekends where you have a lot of craziness happen, and definitely something to watch as we go into it because it's going to be really fun, and I think those bets, at the very least, hopefully, will get over 500. We'll have a very good week, and we'll be able to move forward feeling very good about where we are with these best bets. But let's take our final break here, and when we come back, we got quite a few things to update you on from this past weekend. We got a Georgia-Florida mix-up. They're going to be moving around a little bit over the next couple of years. We have the Big Ten not punishing anyone for that Michigan State-Michigan scuffle. You got the Big 12 dealing with some helmet comms issues, and then we'll give you some head coach updates, some injury updates, and everything else right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the best bets from this upcoming weekend. Definitely some that I feel really good about, including both those service academies, getting big-time wins, covering those spreads, and moving on to possibly get a big-time matchup at the end of the year. But let's get to a little bit of a headline and injury wrap-up because there's quite a few injuries, and there's quite a few headlines that I want to make sure I have on y'all's radar. And we'll start over there in Jacksonville, where there's been a little bit of a mix-up to the Georgia-Florida game, at least over the next couple of years. It sounds like the Georgia-Florida game is going to move away from Jacksonville for the 2026 and 2027 season, so they will be there next year. But after that, they will move to Mercedes-Benz in Atlanta for 2026, Raymond James Stadium in Tampa Bay for 2027. So do a pseudo home and home, I suppose, but Jacksonville, the Jaguars are undergoing a lot of renovation for Everbank Stadium in those years, so they're going to move out of there, hopefully move back once that's done. That being said, I don't like this at all. I think it's very, very ridiculous. I think it's one of those things where you find a way to thread the needle between the two things that we want. We either want it to be in Jacksonville and you keep it in Jacksonville. Now, I understand construction is construction. I'm not necessarily going against that. or go to the campuses. And I understand also if you went to the campuses for the 2 years, it's probably not making its way back to Jacksonville. So I understand it from that perspective. But overall, it's one of those chances you had to put a couple of Georgia-Florida games on campuses, get all of the buzz around those games, and then you could go back to Jacksonville. Maybe you could make that decision, but at the end of the day, give the fans what they want. Even for 2 years, give the fans a little bit of juice in those stadiums, and possibly make this one a little bit of a home and home going forward. I'm kind of indifferent on where this game is played. I do think Jacksonville's a fun place. I think home and home would be absolutely special in this game. So I'm kind of indifferent. I think home and home might be a little bit more my speed, but definitely one where I don't want it in two different NFL stadiums on back-to-back years. That is for sure. But moving forward to the Big 12, they had a little bit of a concern this past weekend, or these past couple of weeks around Texas Tech. There's been a little bit of an issue with helmet communications. At least Texas Tech thought there was a couple of issues. They felt like their games were compromised by other teams during that time, and they asked the Big 12 to look into the loss to Baylor a couple of weeks ago, and then the loss this past weekend to TCU. And they're going to have to figure out, where they move on from here. But sounds like nothing happened here. At least the Big 12 has said there is no proof to believe that these things were obstructed, that these things were messed with or tampered with in any way during the game. So not necessarily something we're going to have to worry about right now. This is something that's going to come up quite a bit. I can almost promise you that. The same way sign stealing and all of that stuff was kind of in the background, this is probably going to be a little bit in the background of college football for quite some time. Obviously, it's not necessarily something you have to worry about until we really have to worry about it, until we have a real case. But as of right now, nothing to really worry about over there at Texas Tech. Definitely something that we're going to be on the lookout for as we move forward with this new world of helmet comms. Then we'll move forward to that Big Ten and Michigan State, Michigan, that little bit of a scuffle, not even a little bit, a huge scuffle that they got into after that game. It sounds like the Big Ten is not going to punish Michigan State or Michigan for that. Now, the melee started after Davis Warren took the knee, and you got into, it was Anthony Jones on the Michigan State side, and then Colston Loveland, the tight end for Michigan, kind of got into it. Got a little bit of headbutting, a little bit of pushing and shoving, and that turned into a whole lot more. This one got very, very aggressive at midfield, and it was one of those things that you see every now and then on a college football field, but it definitely catches you by surprise every single time you see it. I don't love that they're not punishing anyone. I don't necessarily think they have to go really aggressively in one direction or the other, but I think this sets a little bit of a bad precedent. I don't necessarily think teams are going to start brawling each other by any means every single weekend, but I do think this could really only come back to hurt the Big Ten. This could really only come back to possibly happen again. And then if you punish that team, then they're questioning why didn't you punish those two teams. So I do think the two that started it, Anthony Jones and Colston Loveland, should have been punished. I also think Khalil Mullings should have been punished. If you saw the video, he was doing a little bit too much, and he was getting a little bit too involved in that brawl, in that melee, in the whatever you want to call it. It was a big time fight, and it's one of those things that I think as a conference, you just have to say something. You don't necessarily have to ban anyone. You don't necessarily have to fine them incredible amounts of money. You got to do something. You got to stand up, and you have to make sure that that is absolutely tamped out. Now it is not, and we'll see what happens going forward, but definitely something that I don't necessarily love the decision on, and I probably would have made it differently if I was in the Big Ten shoes. But moving forward, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a head coaching update from around the country. We have 3 FBS head coaching jobs that are open right now. It is Rice, Southern Miss, Rice, Southern Miss, and ECU. 3 schools that are kind of on that little bit of a tier right now. They're a little bit teetering in that group of 5 area where ECU has the ability to be a really good program, hasn't been there in a couple of years. I think Southern Miss is the exact same way. And then for Rice, it's going to be a little bit harder, but definitely some guys out there that you can go get. So for ECU, I think there's a lot of guys that could be up for this job. It feels like it's Joe Sloan's job if he wants it. So we'll have to figure that out towards the end of the year as he really gets engaged in those conversations a little bit more, probably after that Alabama game. One way or the other, he will start to get involved in those conversations, and I do think he's probably the guy if he does want this job. Now, if he doesn't, then I think Garrett Riley over at Clemson could be a very good choice. I think there's a number of guys around that area. There's a D coordinator at Georgia Tech, actually Tyler Santucci, that was at UNC last year. So definitely something to watch there. A number of other coordinators around that area that absolutely could be up for this job. But as of right now, it feels like it's Joe Sloan's job to lose, and we'll see what happens down the stretch of the season. Then you got Rice. I think Rice is a very interesting job for so many different reasons. They're in a recruiting hotbed that is Houston. They also have to deal with every other Texas team coming into that hotbed and stealing all the good players from it. And they have to deal with how good of a school it is. It is the best school in Texas academically, and they have to deal with that in the recruiting process of that of the football team. They have to make sure that it is known that certain things have to be done at Rice that don't have to be done at Houston, that don't have to be done at Texas or Texas A&M. So definitely a little bit of a more of an uphill battle, and you'll probably have to find someone that has had to deal with that in the past. The two names that immediately came to mind for me were Buster Faulkner, the Georgia Tech offensive coordinator, obviously has dealt with that over his time at Georgia Tech, and then Tim Beck, the Vandy OC, definitely someone that has dealt with that as well. So I think it could be a very interesting job and one that really could turn into something special. You got to hire the right guy, and it's not always easy to hire the right guy at a place that is so academically inclined like Rice. Then you got Southern Miss, another job that I think is really, really interesting and one that I really think could become an awesome job. I think could become a very, very good team and really put themselves in a great position moving forward. I think Will Stein is probably the guy to watch here. I think there's a number of guys around there, but when you talk about a lot of these different openings, you're going to find a lot of those OCs around these elite teams around the country, whether it's Will Stein at Oregon or maybe Kyle Flood at Texas, maybe Joe Sloan obviously at LSU, a couple other guys that absolutely are going to have a say here. And I think it's going to be one of those where you'll probably get a Will Stein. You'll probably get a little bit younger of a coach, and I think it's one of those jobs that's just waiting for the right coach to come there and really get things off and running, kind of like Billy Napier at Louisiana a couple of years ago. And then on another note, that game over there in Gainesville, Florida, if Billy Napier is to lose that one, I don't think he's the coach on Monday of Florida. I'll just put it that way. We'll see what happens there, but definitely one to watch as we head into this weekend. But talking about that Florida game, apologies. But then we'll get into that Pitt SMU game, a huge, huge one for that team. Actually, sorry, I had a couple of injury updates around the Ohio State game, but realize now that I don't have a picture. But quickly, the Ohio State game, the Zen Mikowski is not going to go in this game. They'll have to figure out who their left tackle is. Could be Donovan Jackson, could be a couple other guys on that team. So definitely something to watch. And going up against Abdul Carter, not necessarily ideal, I'll put it that way. And then on the other side, I do think Drew Aller is going to go in this game. I think it's going to be one of those things where maybe he's not 100%, but it seems like he's going to be at least close enough to go in this game. And then you got Anthony Donko, Danny Dennis Sutton, two linemen, one left tackle, one defensive tackle, going to be huge spots. They're definitely kind of in weird spots going into this game, going to be huge players, and you definitely need them. And if they don't go, then things get a little bit sketchy for Penn State. But now we can move forward. Apologies for that mix-up, but now we can move forward to that Georgia-Florida game. For Georgia, these aren't injuries, but Dan Jackson, Janelle Aguero will be out for the first half of this game because they got targeting calls against Texas that I didn't love by any means, but that's the way it is. They will not be in the first half of this game, so maybe the Gators try to take a couple of deep shots early on in this one. And then you got Tate Ratledge and Jordan Hall. They're both probable for this game. Two guys on both lines of scrimmage that they have been waiting quite a while to get back, but it sounds like they will be ready to go in this game. Would be huge for this team, and finally, we would see this D-line for Georgia at full strength for the first time really this entire season. And then for Florida, the two biggest pieces of news for Florida heading into this one are Montrell Johnson is questionable heading in. Probably need him if you're going to be able to get this one done, so definitely something to watch. And then Eugene Wilson or Trey Wilson will be out for this game. So a couple of big-time playmakers on offense that will not be there. A little bit more on DJ Lagway's shoulders as he heads into this weekend. Then we got Pitt SMU. This is really just all about the quarterbacks here. It sounds like Kevin Jennings is going to go. He went down with a little bit of a knee injury in that Duke game. Got hit pretty good, no doubt about that. But it's one of those things that SMU is going to need him here. It sounds like he's optimistic that he will be able to go in this game. I think he's on that field. If he's not, or even if he's not 100%, definitely takes an aspect away from this SMU offense that they're probably going to need here. And then for Pitt, the big news here is around the quarterbacks as well. Eli Holstein will be back in this game. He got banged up late in that Syracuse game, but he'll be ready to roll in this one. It's going to be a huge one and definitely one that seems to be ready to live up to the hype. Then we got a couple of quarterback updates for you real quickly. We have Curtis Rourke. He is going to go in this game this upcoming weekend against Michigan State for Indiana. We'll see how close to 100% he is, but definitely a player that Indiana is very happy to see back, and they're going to need healthy down the stretch of this season. And then over at Iowa, they have a new starter in Brendan Sullivan. He came and had a great performance last week, and I think he helps this offense a ton. A little bit of running ability on him and has just all the ability to make this offense just run efficiently. It doesn't need to be perfect. It's probably not going to be perfect, but at the very least, you're moving the ball down the field, staying in front of the sticks. That's the ultimate goal in that Iowa offense. And then a couple of extra injury notes here. Trey Harris is questionable for that Arkansas game. He was out last week. Definitely one to watch as we head into this week because it takes a huge aspect out of that Ole Miss offense, and that's exactly what Arkansas needs. Now, the Arkansas offense has taken a big-time hit. Jaquindon Jackson is highly questionable, as Sam Pittman put it, for the matchup against Ole Miss. Going to be really tough if Arkansas does not have this guy. Definitely someone that they need to pull that upset. But Braylon Russell is ready to roll. Very talented freshman that stepped up huge in that Tennessee game. Could be another huge spot for him here. And then you got the Tennessee team. Squirrel White looks like he will return for that Tennessee team, and they need it. They need a guy that can really stretch the ball downfield. They need a guy that just has outright speed, and that's exactly what Squirrel White has. Cannot wait to see him back on the field, and definitely Tennessee fans are very excited about that news. No doubt about that. So a huge week ahead. So many different things that are going to happen this upcoming weekend. Feels like one of those weeks where you're going to want to look over your shoulder. Just make sure that everything is in order. Make sure that you're fully watching these games because I think it could get a little bit wild and definitely set us up for a crazy November down the stretch of this season. But thank you so much for listening to this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. We have great people doing great work across every single sport you can want. So anything in the world of sports that you need, we have you totally covered over here at GSMC. But thank you once again for listening. Go enjoy some football this weekend, and we will talk about it on Monday.